be with you again for a new episode. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review or a 5-star on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That will go a long way to spread the podcast. Last time, we saw how the Democratic Republic of Vietnam mobilized all human and material resources at its disposal for total war. That is what Christopher Gauchat called war communism. And it is very important to always keep that at the back of your mind, because it is this Maoist turn of the DRV that explains how General Giap managed to compete with the French from Hoa Binh in 1952 to Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Hoa Binh, as a reminder, was the city captured by General Delattre at the end of 1951. When he took the city, Delattre swore then to never abandon this position. However, Delattre died in early 1952 and Hoa Binh was evacuated by the French army in February. The French, of course, put positive spin on the Hoa Binh debacle. They talked about it as a tactical and orderly withdrawal. But no one was fooled. General Salon, who replaced Delattre, evacuated his troops just in time to avoid a disaster like in Cao Bang in 1950. Question for the French was now the following. Considering that an elite soldier like Delattre had died on the job without breaking the deadlock against the Viet Minh, wasn't it time to cut their losses and get out of Vietnam? And that was the exact question being discussed in Parliament in 1952. As it happened, Parliament, and France called it l'Assemblée nationale or National Assembly, well, the National Assembly opened only a few days after General Delatte's funeral, and the biggest item on the agenda was to pass a budget where the big ticket was funds for the war in Indochina. And a year earlier, Pierre Mendès France had been booed off the dispatch box after advocating for negotiations with Ho Chi Minh. But in 1952, after preaching in the desert for a long time, Mendès France had now everybody's ear when he got up and said, quote, "Why is it unacceptable to negotiate with the communists while the Americans are doing the same in Korea?" End quote. Well, that's a damn good question. If Indochina and Korea were two fronts of the same war, why was it okay to negotiate with Kim Il-sung in Korea, but not Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam? And unlike in 1951, many members of French Parliament from both the left and the right followed Mendès France's lead and started expressing doubts about a war that was eating up 17% of the national budget of France. In the end, though, the National Assembly voted to allocate 325 billion francs to the war. But when the Prime Minister, or President of the Council as they call it then, when René Pleven spoke, he no longer touted victory, but he promised 12 to 18-month campaign to regain the upper hand and enter negotiations with the Viet Minh from a position of strength. And to convince the MPs to vote the budget, the PM put forward two initiatives. First, he will call a conference with the US and the UK where France will seek a guarantee that the Americans and the Brits would put boots on the ground if China invaded Indochina. Secondly, Pleven warned his MPs against a withdrawal from Vietnam. He said that it would increase the desire for independence in the other parts of the French Empire. And here he was thinking of Morocco and Tunisia. Basically, if we granted independence to the Vietnamese, the others would say, why not us? So, better stay put. So as you can see, there was a lot of soul-searching in Paris, to say the least. But that soul-searching sent alarm bells ringing in Washington. And here, I will venture a comparison. Let me know if it's too far-fetched or not. Imagine that a friend calls you and invites you to weekend somewhere nice. You're not keen to start with, but he sells the weekend so well that you're like, okay, let's do it. And when you start planning, you become more excited than your friend actually. You are really looking forward to the trip. Well, imagine that a few days before you guys leave, the friend calls you, and remember, you have already booked the tickets, rented the car, accommodation, you name it. Your friend calls and say, yo, something came up, I'll have to cancel. And you're like, are you kidding me? Well, if you understand that, you understand how the US felt vis-a-vis France. Remember what we talked about in episode 15, going international. France had purposefully dragged the US in Indochina, and Delat had hammered the point with his US tour in 1951. Therefore, the Americans were now all in 1952. Remember as well that 1952 was an election year in the US, and a certain Republican senator called McCarthy was leading a violent anti-communist crusade. So the anti-communist rhetoric was everywhere, and both Republican and Democrats were convinced that the free world ought to take a stance in Indochina. The Democrats were the incumbents, so they had to show anti-communist bona fides if they wanted to keep the White House. The Republicans knew it, and they were accusing Truman of being soft on Korea after losing China. So Truman did not want to give them more ammunition by going soft also in Indochina. The American president just could not afford to have his French allies having second thoughts in Indochina. Therefore, he told the French, look, stop talking about negotiations with Ho Chi Minh. The French objected by saying, but we cannot fight in Indochina and at the same time fulfill our obligations to NATO and to the European defense community. The Americans said, don't you worry, here's a check. Write how much you need yourself. But gentlemen, when we make the check, you need to hit Ho Chi Minh hard. And if you don't know how to do it, let us show you how it's done. To which the French replied, mind your business, gringos. So from 1952 onwards, the Franco-US alliance will continue to be an uneasy one. On the one hand, the Americans were picking up the tab for the French war and were expecting to have more of a say. The French, though, while they were happy to get financial and diplomatic support, did not want any American interference on the ground. And so let's now go on the ground and see what happened in 1952. Well, after the retreat from Hoa Binh, General Salon, who was now the commander-in-chief, pulled back his troops in the Red River Delta around Hanoi. The only action he took was to launch a few sweeps in the Delta to contain communist infiltrations. There were therefore no major clashes before the start of the monsoon season in May 1952. And by now, you are used to it. You know that with the rainy season, fighting stops, and the two commanders-in-chief use their time to regroup and plan for the autumn. And from now on, what will happen is the war will mainly be fought in central and northern Vietnam. Indeed, in the south of the country, France and its allies had gained the upper hand, and the only thing the Viet Minh could do there was to launch terrorist attacks. For example, in July 1952, a Viet Minh commando, donning French fatigues, attacked a dining hall at Cap Saint-Jacques, where French officers and their families were reveling. The Vietnamese lobbed grenades in the dining hall and opened up with machine guns, killing 8 French officers and 6 children, 4 women, and 4 Vietnamese staff. In addition, 22 people were injured. So these attacks were brutal indeed. But the Viet Minh could do nothing more than that in the south. In the north, it was a whole different ballgame. The Ho Chi Minh government knew by now that they could not conquer the Red River Delta. but they were still looking for a knockout blow. And for that purpose, they were trying to lure the French troops to fight on a terrain where French firepower could not deploy 100%. And that is why General Giap had his eye on the Thai area in northwest Vietnam, along the border with Laos. And why the Thai country? Three main reasons. Militarily, these highlands were difficult to access by plane, and the road network there was almost non-existent. The area was dotted with French military outposts here and there, but there was only one significant garrison town. If General Giap managed to attack the French troops there, it would force Salon not only to spread out his troops thin and away from the delta, but also to fight without much of his armor and aviation. Getting into the Thai country was also politically savvy for the DRV. It was an opportunity to establish themselves in a territory populated by an ethnic minority, the Thai, who were so far allied with the French. Because one common divide and rule tactic the French used was to make themselves the protector of the minorities against the ethnic Viet majority. And last advantage for the DRV, if they struck in the Thai area, they would put pressure on Laos, raising the specter of communist invasion of this associated state of the French Union. So this strategy of a push towards the northwest and Laos was given the green light by Beijing. Liu Shaoqi, one of Mao's main lieutenants, said that it was very important to liberate Laos. In September 1952, the Workers' Party of Vietnam Politburo gave its formal blessing to the Northwest campaign. Afterwards, Ho Chi Minh made the trip to Beijing to ask for Mao's blessing. The two leaders agreed on a campaign in two stages to finish the war. First, push towards the northwest and liberate Laos, and in a second phase, put the pressure on the French Delta by attacking from the north. No sooner said than done. In October, 30,000 men from the 308th, 312th, and 316 divisions launched an attack on Gialo, the main French garrison town. This town, having 30,000 inhabitants, was the bridgehead of the French military in the northwest. If captured by the DRV, all French positions in the region would be threatened. And this threat materialized when men of the 312th Division surrounded a garrison 40 kilometers from Gialo. Things were serious. A parachute battalion commanded by Commandant Bijard was then dropped between the town and Gialo to shore up the line of defense. But their position became untenable when on the 17th of October, two regiments of the 308th Division attacked Gialo and took the French garrison within an hour. The French lost 700 men in Gialo, and the entire French system was now on the verge of collapse in the northwest. All the little garrisons in the Thai area were captured or were abandoned by the French soldiers. The Vietnamese gave chase to the retreating French troops, and it was a mad dash to reach more secure positions along the Black River for the French. It was every man to himself, and nobody thought that Bijard and his men, for example, would have survived this dangerous game of catch me if you can. But miraculously, Commandant Bijard started writing his legend and got away with it after losing 15% of his troops. So Gialo had fallen, and this was a terrible blow to French prestige after the retreat of Hoa Binh. The morale of the French troop was now as low as it was after Cao Bang, and General Salon had to react. He launched two actions, Opération Lorraine and Nassan. Nassan, that's the garrison where all those soldiers kicked out of the northwest found refuge. It was 190 kilometers from Hanoi, and it was a base established between Laos and the Delta, wedged between the Thai area and central Vietnam. General Salon's idea was to concentrate his troops there in a fire support base. Salon was baiting General Giap to attack Nassan, and he had planes and heavy artillery ready to wreak havoc on Vietnamese troops. At the same time, Salon launched a massive operation called Lorraine on the 29th of October. To simplify Lorraine, this was just a diversionary tactic to pin down Vietnamese troops somewhere else. Salon attacked Viet Minh bases northwest of Hanoi, including one of Giap's main supply centers. His idea was to try to force General Giap to peel troops from the Thai area. And this diversionary tactic ended up being the largest military operation of the Indochina War because it involved 30,000 French troops with air support and heavy artillery. And there were few results for sure. The French captured a considerable amount of equipment, Russian Molotov trucks, for example, and artillery pieces. Problem? General Giap did not take the bait, and he kept his regular troops in the northwest. What he did, though, was to order regional forces to harass the French columns, and they did so relentlessly. Indeed, it was difficult and expensive to supply the troops of Lorraine by air. So the French had massive convoys on the road and rivers, and those convoys were constantly attacked by regional Viet forces. The French were losing equipment and men by the dozen every day. And after 15 days of being harassed by guerrilla forces but not being confronted by the enemy, the French decided to put an end to a very demanding operation and retreat back to the Delta. But as many soldiers will tell you, troops are at their most vulnerable when they are retreating. And the DRV increased the guerrilla activities and inflicted maximum damage on the retreating French troops. For example, on November 17, a Viet Minh detachment set a giant ambush and trapped a French column. The fighting went on all day, and the French suffered 300 casualties. And there were many instances like that. In the end, the French lost 1,200 troops with nothing to show for it. Well, they had captured Russian equipment, and they now had proof that Russian aid was reaching the DRV. But they failed to bait the regular forces of the Vietnamese People Army. Worse, the Viet Minh made the most of the lack of troops in the Delta, because all troops were in Lorraine or in Nassan. Because there was a vacuum in the Delta, the infiltration escalated and the Viet Minh conquered even more territory within the Red River Delta. So morale was therefore high on the DRV side when Giap moved to the second phase, capture Nassan, the stronghold when Salon had regrouped his forces in the northwest. The Nassan garrison was bizarre because it was isolated and it was accessible only by air. Therefore, General Giap thought that he could take it quickly. However, either because of an error of judgment or because of inaccurate intelligence, Giap failed. What he didn't take into consideration is that after the withdrawal from the northwest, the garrison in Nassan was reinforced and numbers reached 12,000 men, more than double what Giap thought. His estimation was a French garrison of around 5,000 men. Secondly, Salon was a good general. He built his stronghold around the airfield because he knew that the survival of his soldiers depended on planes. So he built a thick line of defense around the landing strip to put it out of range from enemy fire by any means necessary. And finally, from mid-October, Salon organized a massive airlift campaign between Nassan and Hanoi. There were one plane every 15 minutes landing in Nassan and bringing reinforcements, equipment, weapons, and ammunition. Nassan was what the French call a base aéroterrestre, an airland base, powerfully supported by heavy artillery and by the Air Force, and it was ready for the Vietnamese onslaught. That onslaught came when General Giap launched 3 assaults between the 23rd and 30th of November. And all those assaults were repelled after fierce fighting. The French 105mm howitzers wreaked havoc on the Vietnamese People's Army, and the Air Force poured massive amounts of napalm on the Bordeaux. On the 4th of December, after nearly 2 weeks of trying to overrun Nassan, General Giap withdrew his troops, leaving at least 1,500 dead and 2,000 wounded on the ground. Other estimations of casualties are even higher, some historians speaking of 6,000 dead and wounded on the Vietnamese side. As he did against the Lat, Giap had bitten off more than he could chew. He believed that Nassan was a ripe fruit ready for the picking and sent his soldier to the slaughter. On the French side, the press went overboard, celebrating the hedgehogs of Nassan. And General Salon felt vindicated. The hedgehog tactic, meaning having a very strong garrison supplied and protected by air, well, that tactic had worked. And now I see that some of you are already thinking about Dien Bien Phu. And yes, in hindsight, Nassan appeared to be a kind of dress rehearsal for Dien Bien Phu. But the situation were very different. But what we can say is that General Giap learned many lessons at Nassan. He understood, for example, that without heavy artillery, it was impossible for him to reach the airstrip, and that's where the battle was decided. Throughout the battle, Nassan was reinforced and resupplied continuously. If General Giap wanted to win against the French, he had to find a way to prevent air supply. As a result, Giap updated his shopping list to Beijing and penciled down 105mm artillery guns and shells. And remember this detail, we'll talk about it later at Dien Bien Phu. So, the year 1952 ended with the French victory. The French command touted Nassan as a major victory, and no doubt that General Giap had to submit to severe self-criticism when he returned to HQ. But focusing too much on Nassan means not seeing the wood for the trees. Why? Well, before Nassan, in 1952 alone, the French had retreated from Hoa Binh, been kicked out of Diallo, and failed spectacularly in Opération Lorraine. While Nassan repelled assaults after assaults, General Giap sent troops towards Laos. And in the Delta, well, Viet Minh infiltration was so widespread that the Catholic stronghold of Bui Chu was now on the verge of collapse, and there were regular clashes everywhere in the Red River Delta. So General Salon still faced the same dilemma as every French military commander before him. There were just not enough troops to both secure the Delta and go after the Vietnamese People's Army. So which option to choose? Spread the troops thin and chase the enemy? Or abandon the Thai country and Laos to focus on the defense of the Red River Delta? In the next episode, General Salon too will bow out of Indochina. He will be sacked after the DRV troops invaded Laos. And this invasion of Laos will have two opposing consequences. On the one hand, it will alarm the Americans even more, and the new Republican administration will put more pressure on France to win the war in Indochina. But in 1953, France did not believe they could win anymore. and they just had to save face. The strategic divergence between the US and France will have very serious consequences. But we'll see that next time. Until then, be well and goodbye.